Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly. I'm a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do digital painting. In this week's video, I'll be going over my process behind painting this ink cap mushroom, also known as an inky cap mushroom, and this is part of my bat painting I've been working on for a while now. If you would like to see the process behind how I painted the bat, check out the videos that I have linked on the screen or in the description down below. Alright, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm doing, I always start with my watercolor pencils. I love them, but I have been using a lot more actual watercolors. I'll get into that later. But right now I'm starting with a purple watercolor pencil, and I'm making a an intense gradient from the edge of the drips on the mushroom upwards, and same thing on the stem. And on the stem, this is for a shadow. For the cap part, that's just the color of the mushroom. Near the edges, there's a lot of these inky drips, hence the name ink cap. You get it? All right, I think you get it. I also went in with a burnt umber watercolor pencil and kind of etched in some subtle texture. There's a lot of texture and it almost looks like the cap is peeling a bit. I added that texture in with a burnt umber watercolor pencil, and of course I got a wet brush and blended that out into a gradient, and this is a great base layer for the following layers of gouache I will be applying. I also used the yellow ochre watercolor pencil that I have in areas where I know the warmer light is going to be hitting the mushroom, and there's going to be more warmth there right after the high point of highlight, and a little bit more saturation of that beigey color. So it's very subtle, but you know, the little details like that are what make this pop. All right. I also added that on the very, very top part of the mushroom. Alright, so something to keep a note of as I'm painting. On the right side, the majority is going to be a warmer light source, and on the left is going to be an overcast, I wouldn't call it a rim light, but like light that's overcast light being reflected back on the other side of the mushroom. I like adding two light sources, one that's very subtle and one that's more, you know, the main light source, because I feel like it gives a sense of dimension. It really makes things feel very well rounded. It also allows me to use cool versus warm tones in my painting. In this case, throughout the whole painting, I'm using a lot of purples and yellows. So yellows are the warmer colors and purple is for like the shadows and where it recedes into the painting. I'm using a lot of titanium white over all of this watercolor I've already put down. I put a lot more just plain titanium white in the areas where there's going to be the high point of highlight. As it goes up into the shadow, I'm adding a lot more beige because it's also on the right side, so there's a warmer light source coming down from the right, and as that highlight comes up and meets the shadow, there's going to be a merge right there where it's going to be more saturated and read more as beige because that's the overall color of the stem. Very subtle, but like I said, little details like that are what really make things feel real. It's the little color shifts like that. I also put some lavender. You can't really see, it's hiding underneath the butterfly. That's a butterfly, by the way. I'm not painting over it because I'm going to use a different painting technique for the butterfly, but underneath the butterfly you can see that there's some lavender there, and that's kind of like where it's receding to the side, going back and catching that overcast cool light. Going in now with ivory black, and I'm making sure that these drips are the darkest dark, because if you look at the reference, they are very inky, as we have discussed previously. I'm putting down some more violet. For purples, I've been really enjoying using the Engram watercolors. They have honey in them. A lot of watercolors, they use sugars as a way for it to blend and bleed beautifully. and the M-gram kind actually uses honey instead of like corn syrup. It's really cool. They blend like a dream, and they're very pigmented, very vibrant. I noticed that when I try mixing my own purples, they're not nearly as vibrant as, you know, using a actual purple pigment. So that's what I'm using here, and I blended that upwards. And it's a little transparent now because, you know, it's watercolor, but I'm going to go back in with some more titanium white and some beige, and that's going to add some opacity to that layer. I'm also going back in, fixing those color shifts of the beige area. Anytime I want to make a very subtle shift in colors with gradients, I love using watercolor pencils because it doesn't mess up the texture of the gouache that you have already laid down. It makes just such a little thin layer, and it blends beautifully without having to mess up all the work you just did trying to make such a smooth blended gradient with gouache, because as you know, with gouache it can be a pain in the ass to make a smooth gradient. All right, and once you have it, you're like, all right, this is it, you know. I'm doing the same thing, and I really just wanted to punch that contrast. I love high contrast in my artwork, and I'm really just accentuating that on the drips as well as the shadow underneath the cap. I just felt like that could have been pushed further, and I didn't want to risk going in with gouache entirely, so I just went back in with a watercolor pencil that's ivory black, and I'm blending that in, and as you can see, it does a beautiful job at doing exactly what I wanted, enhancing the shadow without having to mess up my gradients too much. It barely took any time for me to blend that in, like really. Usually I love making everything look super smooth and even with gouache, but I allowed myself to show more rough texture with the bristle, very, very slight texture, but I felt like that kind of went with how the mushroom naturally looks. The stem is not super rough, but you know, there's texture there, and especially the cap, it's very textured. So I didn't try to worry too much about making everything perfect and smooth before going on to the next layer. In general, I try not to do that anyways, because with gouache, as you know, when you put on another layer of paint, depending on how much water you're using, it's going to bring up the underneath layer, and you're going to be blending anyway. So there's no point in making the first layer like super perfectly smooth how you want, because it's gonna get there through the layers over time anyway, depending on how much water you end up using. A general rule of thumb, you use a lot more water in the beginning of your painting than in the end. Usually for more detailed, precise, textural things, you use hardly any water at all, sometimes none. So as I just mentioned, the cap on these mushrooms are super textured. They look like they're peeling, and I actually saw online that they are also called a shaggy ink cap mushroom because they look shaggy, I guess. Yeah, so I'm intentionally making these vertical lines like as if it's like peeling up, because that's kind of what it looks like. It looks like it's kind of peely. Looks like she needs to exfoliate. Okay, I don't want to judge. All right, but you know, your girl could use some salicylic acid on there, and just saying. I crack myself up. Anyways, so I'm doing vertical lines to give that illusion, and here's the hard part. Here's the hard part, especially if you are like me and you have to be like, stop blending. Stop blending. Especially if you're a perfectionist, just listen to this one piece of advice, all right? When you have to paint rough, organic textures, like for instance, I also went over this when I had to paint the moon. You can check that out in this video here. Do not look at your reference. Stop it. Stop looking at your reference. I see you. I see you being 1 inch away looking at your reference. I see you. Stop it. Put it away. Close your iPad. Turn off your phone. Stop. Okay? Any other time you can look at your reference except for here. Do not think. Create unintentional lines. And the reason why I say that is If you are intentionally trying to create something that's organic, it's not going to look organic. It's just not going to. It's going to feel manufactured. You want to let yourself, quote unquote, mess up, not really, but create things that are irregular looking. When you look at the irregularities that you are creating with your brush, blur your eyes, unfocus your eyes, and look at the shapes that are naturally occurring. That is where you can get some interesting shapes that are organic and unintentional, and around those areas you can further describe them with highlight and shadow. So what I did here was I forced myself to stop looking at the reference because I saw myself doing that. I was creating vertical lines because that is the general shape of the texture on the cap, and I just made unintentional vertical scribbles, unfocused my eyes, and I saw in areas where naturally there were some ledges being created, and those are the areas where I further pushed the values. I put shadows underneath those little ledges of those little peelies. I put more high points of highlights where I feel that those little peeled ledges would catch more light, especially where the light source is really hitting the mushroom, and it looks organic. Now, I discovered this when I had to paint the moon. When I was intentionally creating craters, those things looked like polka dots, and I don't want a Swiss cheese moon. I'm sorry, I don't. I'm lactose intolerant. I don't want that. So I had to allow myself to create random textures and scribbles, unfocus my eyes, and be like, I see organic shapes starting to happen. If you let yourself do that, it'll start to feel more real. I really like this technique for all sorts of organic textures like grass, rocks, bark on a tree, things like that. So after I made my unintentional scribbles, I looked at areas where I naturally saw a little ledge, and I went back in with my violet watercolor pencil to create some of those drop shadows where that texture kind of peels and flips upwards. I'm also going in with an ivory black watercolor pencil in areas where I feel the shadows would be longer and more drawn out and dramatic. I'm using a very tiny wet brush to blend this out because I don't want to smudge any of the gouache underneath. This is where you have to be careful. Alright, you have to use enough water to blend that out, but use a tiny brush so that you can be very precise with where this is going so it doesn't smudge too much of what you've already put so much hard work into creating. Alright, so now we're at the point where I'm probably not even going to use water. If I use water, it's going to be very minimal. I'm in the stage where I'm using a damp brush at most, if not a dry brush with just paint out of the tube. And I'm going back in with some titanium white, and on those little ledges I just created shadows for. I'm creating more unintentional vertical line scribblies to further enhance that texture and that scooped up appearance that they have. For this portion of the painting, I did experiment with different brushes I have because especially with texture that you're trying to create in a painting, the type of brush that you're using is going to create a very different effect. I tried using one that was very short, and I usually use it for scrubbing, and that wound up giving too soft of an appearance, almost like a fine sandpaper, and I wanted something more gritty with larger grit to it. So I got this other brush I have that's kind of dried out, starting to split. It's kind of hooked at the end, and I'm using those hairs on the brush that are kind of hooked to create more very, very miniature vertical lines. I'm making them vertical, but I'm also kind of just scratching with it. I'm not getting the brush too wet. This is just paint right here. Another thing I'm doing is I'm concentrating those high points of highlights that I just put down. With every layer, I'm getting smaller and more specific with my placement of that really, really vibrant, straight up white paint. because if you end up making everything a high point of highlight, there's going to be no contrast, and with no contrast means less texture, less form. It's going to flatten your painting. So with these straight out of the tube moments where you really want straight up white paint to highlight something, with each layer that you do that, make it smaller and more specific so it really reads as like high definition. Over the course of this whole painting, I've been adding highlights to the stem as well, but I'm adding the final layer of the highest point of highlight on the stem by using 0 water, just white, titanium white paint out of the tube with a dry brush, and I just stippled that on, and that just enhanced the texture and also made the light source seem more intense. Finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, let's just be for real, the highlights on the ink drips on the mushroom cap. Come on. This is very self-explanatory. I used a damp brush. It's not just straight up white paint. There's a little bit of water going on here. And I just made very thin, high contrast highlights to make it look glossy on the drips. I also lightened the drips that are on the other side of the mushroom and incorporated more violet to make it look like it's receding into the background. I didn't want to add that really stark highlight because I felt that would flatten the whole effect and the light wouldn't be that strong there. Alrighty, well this is how this ink cap mushroom turned out. I have a few others on this painting I have to paint, but you know, it's essentially the same process. If you guys liked this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing, perhaps. And I will see you next week. Bye!